Some people will tell you exactly who they are the moment they refuse your hand. The room fell silent for half a second, then the laughter began. Ava Brooks stood at the end of the 28-foot conference table, her hands still extended, her posture calm, her expression unreadable. Across from her, Richard Coleman, CEO of Coleman Dynamics, glanced briefly at her outstretched hand before turning away as if he hadn't seen it at all. The movement was subtle, deliberate. More than 30 executives and board members watched it happen beneath the soft glow of crystal chandeliers hanging over the Manhattan boardroom. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the skyline beyond, sunlight reflecting off towers of glass and steel. For a moment, Ava simply lowered her hand. No anger, no embarrassment, no visible reaction. Yet the atmosphere shifted. A few people exchanged glances. Others smiled. Then one of the board members chuckled under his breath. Another followed. Soon several voices joined in. Not loud enough to seem cruel, just enough to make their opinion clear. Richard adjusted the cuff of his tailored navy suit and walked toward the head of the table. "Let's get started," he said. His tone carried the confidence of a man who had spent decades being the most powerful person in every room he entered. Around him sat investors, attorneys, vice presidents, and advisors. Some opened laptops. Others shuffled presentation packets. Nobody offered Ava a seat. Nobody introduced her. Nobody asked why she was there. A woman near the center of the table leaned toward a colleague and whispered, "I thought the investment representative was supposed to arrive today." Her colleague smirked. "Maybe she's early with the coffee." A few restrained laughs followed. Ava heard every word. She simply placed her leather portfolio on the table and remained standing. The marble beneath her heels gleamed under the afternoon light. She could hear the faint hum of the building's climate system and the distant sound of traffic 27 stories below. Richard clicked a remote. A giant screen illuminated behind him. Charts appeared. Revenue projections. Expansion plans. Market forecasts. The board's attention immediately shifted to him. Exactly where he liked it. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard began. "Today marks the beginning of the most important growth phase in our company's history." Confidence filled his voice. The kind of confidence people often mistake for certainty. Ava watched quietly. She noticed details. The inflated projections hidden inside the forecasts. The assumptions buried beneath optimistic percentages. The way certain board members nodded before seeing the data. The way others laughed at jokes before hearing them. It reminded her of something her father used to say back in Atlanta. When people get comfortable with power, they stop paying attention to truth. Richard continued speaking while assistants distributed updated financial packets. Nobody handed one to Ava. One assistant walked directly past her without making eye contact. Another assumed she was waiting for someone and politely pointed toward the reception area outside the conference room. "Guests usually wait out there," he said. Ava smiled gently. "Thank you." She didn't move. Minutes passed. Richard paced confidently across the room as slides changed behind him. Every few moments, another member of the board laughed at one of his remarks. The atmosphere felt less like a serious investment meeting and more like an audience applauding a performance. Then Richard's gaze briefly landed on Ava again. "Excuse me," he said. The room quieted. "Can someone help this woman find where she's supposed to be?" A ripple of laughter swept through the boardroom. This time louder. More comfortable. More confident. Ava slowly lifted her eyes and met his gaze. The sunlight caught the edge of her portfolio. Her expression never changed. And for the first time that afternoon, something about her calm seemed completely out of place in a room full of people who believed they already knew exactly who she was. Ava Brooks did not answer immediately. The laughter faded little by little, not because anyone felt uncomfortable, but because they expected her to leave. Instead, she remained exactly where she was, one hand resting lightly on her portfolio, her shoulders relaxed beneath a charcoal blazer that looked elegant without trying to impress anyone. Richard Coleman waited. So did everyone else. Outside the windows, the late afternoon sun reflected off the Hudson River, turning the glass towers beyond into sheets of gold. Inside the boardroom, the silence stretched long enough to become noticeable. Ava finally smiled. It was a small smile. Polite. Controlled. "I am exactly where I am supposed to be," she said. A few people exchanged amused looks. One board member leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. Another shook his head as if she simply did not understand how these meetings worked. Richard let out a short breath through his nose. "Well," he said, glancing around the room, "this is a private executive session." His voice remained smooth, but there was impatience underneath it now. "If you are looking for someone from investor relations, the reception desk can help you." More smiles appeared around the table. Ava noticed them all. Years ago, those smiles might have bothered her. Back when she was a teenager watching her mother finish 12-hour nursing shifts before coming home exhausted. Back when people saw her father in his city bus uniform and assumed they already knew his story. Life had taught her something valuable since then. People often revealed themselves long before they revealed the truth. Richard turned back toward the presentation screen. The meeting moved on. Revenue projections filled the display. Growth forecasts stretched 5 years into the future. Charts climbed steadily upward in bright blue lines. Several board members nodded approvingly. Ava opened her portfolio. Inside sat a yellow legal pad covered with handwritten notes. No assistant had prepared them. No analyst had summarized them. Every observation came from her own review. She quietly began writing additional comments as Richard spoke. The scratching of her pen was almost invisible beneath the hum of the room. Yet it grounded her. It reminded her why she was there. Around the table, confidence continued to build. Executives discussed expansion into new markets. They spoke about projected earnings. They celebrated anticipated acquisitions. Every statement sounded polished. Every number sounded impressive. But Ava kept noticing the same thing. Certain assumptions appeared again and again. Revenue estimates depended on perfect outcomes. Risk factors were minimized. Cost projections seemed unusually optimistic. She circled 3 figures on her notepad, then 4 more. Richard clicked to another slide. Applause followed before he had even finished explaining it. Ava looked up slowly. The board was not studying the data. They were responding to the man presenting it. There was a difference, and it was an expensive one. Sunlight shifted across the polished conference table. The golden reflection moved toward her side of the room. Richard continued speaking confidently, unaware that the quiet woman everyone had dismissed was no longer evaluating his presentation. She was evaluating his judgment. And with every passing minute, the distance between those two things grew wider. The meeting settled into a rhythm that felt increasingly familiar to everyone except Ava Brooks. Confidence moved through the room like a current. Executives nodded before questions were finished. Board members exchanged approving smiles whenever Richard Coleman spoke. The polished oak table reflected the afternoon light, and the giant screen behind him displayed another set of projections that drew quiet murmurs of approval. Richard stood comfortably at the center of it all. By the end of the 3rd fiscal year, he said, tapping a chart with his remote, we expect revenue growth of nearly 40%. Several heads nodded immediately. One director even smiled and whispered, outstanding. Ava looked down at her notes. 40%. She had circled that number twice already. Her eyes moved across the supporting assumptions beneath the projection. Customer acquisition costs were unusually low. Expansion expenses seemed compressed. Regulatory delays had practically disappeared from the forecast. She slowly wrote another note in the margin. The room kept moving forward. Richard clicked to the next slide. Applause followed again. Our analysts have spent months refining these models, he continued. Every major variable has been accounted for. Ava lifted her eyes toward the screen. Every major variable except reality, she thought. Around her, confidence continued building on itself. It was not just belief in the numbers. It was belief in the person presenting them. Richard had spent years cultivating that trust. He carried himself with certainty. He spoke without hesitation. People listened because they expected him to be right. Sometimes that was enough to keep difficult questions from being asked. Ava noticed a projected manufacturing timeline. Another red circle appeared on her notepad. Then a logistics estimate. Another circle. Then projected overseas licensing approvals. Another. One after another. Small details. Expensive details. The kind that could transform a promising venture into a costly mistake. Richard moved to the final section of the presentation. This opportunity represents the future of Coleman Dynamics. His voice filled the room. And with the right investment partners, there is no limit to what we can achieve. The board responded with enthusiastic nods. A few even began gathering their papers as though the decision had already been made. Ava watched quietly. The confidence in the room had reached a point where nobody seemed interested in examining the foundation beneath it. Then she saw a figure on the screen that made her pause. Her pen stopped moving. The projected operating margin was based on an assumption she recognized immediately. Not because it was impressive, because it was impossible. She read it twice, then a third time. The number remained unchanged. Ava slowly closed her notebook. The soft sound of the cover folding shut seemed insignificant, yet it felt louder than the presentation itself. Her gaze returned to the screen, then to Richard, then back to the documents spread across the table. The room remained unaware. Executives exchanged satisfied looks. Directors prepared for what they assumed would be a routine approval. Outside the windows, the sunlight had begun to fade, casting longer shadows across the conference table. Inside, Ava reached for the printed financial packet that had been left near the end of the table. She turned to a specific page and studied it carefully. A small discrepancy connected to another, then another. Within seconds, a larger picture began forming. The kind of picture experienced investors learn to recognize before everyone else. Richard smiled as he prepared to conclude his presentation. He believed the meeting was almost over. Ava realized something very different. For the first time that afternoon, she knew the real meeting had not started yet. Richard Coleman set the remote on the table and straightened his jacket. The final slide remained glowing behind him, filled with ambitious numbers and confident projections. Around the room, several board members were already reaching for their pens. One director adjusted his glasses and smiled. Another quietly whispered that the proposal looked stronger than expected. The momentum was moving in only one direction. Approval felt inevitable. Then a calm voice interrupted the room. "I have a question." The words were not loud, yet they seemed to stop every other sound. Richard turned slowly. So did everyone else. Ava Brooks remained standing beside her chair, one hand resting on the closed portfolio. Her expression was composed. Her voice carried neither hostility nor hesitation. Richard offered a polite smile that did not reach his eyes. "Questions will be addressed after the vote." Ava glanced toward the financial packet. The operating margin forecast on page 72 assumes manufacturing costs remain flat during expansion. A few people exchanged confused looks. Richard nodded once. "That is correct." Ava tilted her head slightly. "Then how are you accounting for the supplier contracts that expire in 14 months? Silence. Small but noticeable. Richard's smile tightened. "Our procurement team has already reviewed those agreements." Ava looked down at the document. Then perhaps they noticed the automatic escalation clauses. Several board members shifted in their seats. One executive opened his packet and began turning pages. Richard folded his arms. "Miss Brooks, our analysts have spent months building these projections." Ava met his gaze. "I am sure they have." Her answer was calm, respectful, yet something about it seemed to irritate him more than an argument would have. He walked a few steps closer. "With all due respect, this discussion involves highly specialized financial modeling." A few smiles appeared around the table. One board member quietly chuckled. Another leaned back with obvious amusement. Ava remained completely still. "That is exactly why I asked." The room grew quieter. Richard continued before she could speak again. "The projections have been independently reviewed." "By whom?" Ava asked. The question landed harder than anyone expected. Richard paused, only for a second, yet everyone noticed it. "Multiple consultants," he replied. Ava nodded slowly. "Did any of them challenge the licensing timeline assumptions?" More pages began turning around the table. A woman near the center of the room lowered her glasses and started reading more carefully. Another executive typed something into a laptop. Richard's patience was beginning to thin. "What exactly is your point?" Ava opened the packet and turned to a highlighted section. "My point is that several key assumptions appear dependent on perfect conditions." She looked up. "Markets rarely operate under perfect conditions." The room became very still. Richard let out a short laugh. It was the kind people used when they wanted others to laugh with them. Several did. "Well," he said, glancing toward the board, "fortunately investment decisions are made using expertise, not hypothetical concerns." More laughter followed, this time louder, more comfortable. Ava listened without reacting. Across the table, one director was no longer smiling. He was studying the figures she had referenced. Another board member had stopped taking notes entirely. Richard noticed neither. He was focused on Ava. I think we have spent enough time on this distraction, he said. Security can help escort her back to reception if necessary. A few people laughed again, but not as many as before. Because for the first time since the meeting began, several members of the board were no longer looking at Ava Brooks. They were looking at the numbers. The temperature of the room seemed to change without anyone touching the thermostat. The laughter that had followed Richard Coleman's remark faded unevenly, leaving behind an uncomfortable quiet that settled over the boardroom like dust. Several members were now reviewing pages they had ignored earlier. Others stared at their screens, comparing figures. The easy confidence that had filled the room 30 minutes ago was beginning to crack. Richard noticed it. That irritated him more than Ava Brooks ever could. He walked back toward the head of the table and rested both hands on the polished surface. We are not here to debate every theoretical risk scenario, he said. His voice remained controlled, but the edge beneath it had become impossible to miss. We are here to evaluate a growth opportunity. Ava looked at him calmly. A growth opportunity should survive basic scrutiny. A few heads lifted. The words were simple. The effect was not. Richard shook his head and smiled toward the board as though entertaining an unreasonable interruption. This is exactly why investment professionals rely on experienced leadership. He glanced briefly toward Ava. Not random opinions from people who happened to walk into a meeting. Several people laughed again. This time the laughter felt forced. One board member joined half a second late. Another did not laugh at all. Ava remained silent. Richard interpreted the silence as surrender. Thank you, he said. Now, if there are no serious questions, we can proceed with the vote. He reached for the remote. Before he could continue, a voice came from halfway down the table. Actually, I would like clarification on the supplier escalation issue. Richard froze almost imperceptibly. The question came from Michael Hayes, the company's chief financial officer. Michael rarely interrupted presentations. Around the room, attention shifted immediately. Richard looked toward him. We have already reviewed that internally. Michael adjusted his glasses. Perhaps, but I would still like clarification. More silence. Ava said nothing. She simply watched. Richard clicked to another slide and attempted to move forward. The concern is insignificant relative to overall projected returns. Michael did not look convinced. Neither did Linda Foster, the chairwoman, who was now quietly reading through the packet herself. Richard could feel the room slipping away from him. The presentation was no longer controlling the discussion. The questions were. His jaw tightened. Then his eyes landed on Ava once more. In that moment, he made a decision. I think we have spent enough time on this, he said firmly. Miss Brooks, I am going to ask you to leave so the board can continue its work. The words hung in the air. No one spoke. Ava slowly closed the packet in front of her. The soft sound seemed louder than Richard's voice. She placed the document neatly back inside her portfolio. Around the room, several people watched her. Some looked uncomfortable. Others looked relieved. Richard straightened his tie. He believed he had regained control. Security will assist if necessary, he added. Ava rose from her chair with quiet dignity. Not a trace of anger crossed her face. Not a single protest. She simply lifted her portfolio and looked around the room one last time. Her eyes briefly met Michael's, then Linda's, then Richard's. The fading sunlight reflected against the glass walls behind her, outlining her silhouette in gold. Richard expected embarrassment. He expected frustration. Instead, he saw something far more unsettling. Certainty. Ava gave a small nod as if a decision had finally become clear. Then she turned toward the door. And for reasons none of them could yet explain, several people suddenly felt far less confident about the vote they were about to take. The conference room door closed softly behind Ava Brooks. The sound was barely noticeable, yet it seemed to separate two different worlds. Inside, executives continued discussing forecasts, projections, and votes. Outside, the hallway stretched quietly beneath rows of recessed lights and polished stone floors. Ava walked without hurry. Her heels moved across the marble with a steady rhythm that echoed faintly through the corridor. She reached a wall of glass overlooking the city and stopped. Far below, streams of yellow taxi cabs flowed through Manhattan streets like ribbons of light. The sun was sinking toward the horizon, painting the skyline in shades of gold and amber. Ava rested her portfolio against her side and looked out at the city she had spent years learning to navigate. Not just its streets, its people, its assumptions, Its invisible rules. Behind her, muffled voices continued through the conference room walls. She could not hear the words, only the tone. Confident, certain, familiar. For a long moment, she simply stood there. Her reflection stared back from the glass. Calm eyes, relaxed shoulders. No anger, no bitterness. Yet there was disappointment. Not because she had been asked to leave. She had experienced that before in different forms throughout her life. The disappointment came from something deeper. Richard Coleman had never truly seen her. Neither had most of the people in that room. They saw her skin, her age, her quiet demeanor, her simple clothing. Then they built an entire story around those details. A story that required no evidence and welcomed no correction. Ava thought about her father waking before dawn to drive city buses through Atlanta traffic. She thought about her mother returning home after exhausting shifts at the hospital. Neither had ever complained when people underestimated them. They simply kept showing up, kept working, kept proving that dignity did not require permission. The memory brought a faint smile to her face. Her phone vibrated gently. One message, then another. She looked down. The screen displayed updates from her legal and investment teams. Everything was ready. Everything had been ready before she entered the building that morning. Ava read the messages carefully. Then she locked the screen and slipped the phone back into her purse. She did not answer immediately. Decisions involving hundreds of millions of dollars were never emotional for her. They required clarity, patience, discipline, the same qualities her parents had spent years teaching her. Through the glass, the last edge of sunlight touched the rooftops beyond the river. The city seemed quieter from 27 floors above the streets. Almost peaceful. Ava took a slow breath. The investment represented more than money. It represented trust, partnership, shared vision. Those things could not exist where respect was absent. A pair of employees walked through the hallway behind her. They glanced in her direction, then continued on. Neither recognized her. Neither knew the decision that was quietly taking shape only a few feet away. Ava looked once more toward the conference room door. Her expression remained gentle, thoughtful, certain. Then she reached for her phone again and opened a secure message thread. Her fingers moved calmly across the screen. The instruction she typed contained only a few words. Simple words. Professional words. Yet by the time the sun disappeared behind the skyline, they would change everything happening inside that boardroom. Inside the boardroom, Richard Coleman had finally regained what he believed was control. The discussion had shifted back toward voting procedures. Several directors were reviewing final notes. Others checked messages on tablets and laptops. The tension that Ava Brooks had introduced seemed to be fading. Richard stood near the head of the table with renewed confidence. "If there are no further interruptions," he said, "we can move forward." Then a notification appeared on Linda Foster's screen. At first she ignored it. Board members received dozens of messages during meetings. But a second alert followed immediately. Then a third. Her expression changed. Subtly at first. Then completely. She sat up straighter and opened the message. The color drained from her face. Michael Hayes noticed. "Linda," he asked quietly. She did not answer. Her eyes moved across the screen again. Slower this time. As if she hoped the words would somehow change. They did not. Across the table, Richard continued speaking. "The market opportunity remains exceptional, and I believe the board recognizes that." Linda suddenly raised a hand. "Richard." He stopped. Something in her voice forced the entire room to pay attention. The air seemed heavier. Michael looked toward her. "What is it?" Linda turned her laptop slightly. "We have a problem." Silence settled across the boardroom. Richard frowned. "What kind of problem?" Linda looked directly at him. "A very expensive one." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The city lights outside were beginning to replace the fading sunlight. Reflections shimmered against the glass walls. Inside the room, every eye remained fixed on Linda. She clicked open an attached document. A logo appeared at the top of the screen. Several directors immediately recognized it. Impact Horizon Capital. Michael's eyes widened. "That cannot be right." Linda swallowed. "It is." Richard stared at the screen. Confusion slowly replaced confidence. "What exactly am I looking at?" Linda took a slow breath. "A formal withdrawal notice." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. No one reacted immediately. They simply stared. Richard laughed once. Nervously. "Withdrawal from what?" Linda looked at him as though she could not believe the question. "The investment." The room froze. Michael leaned forward. Another director removed his glasses. Someone at the far end of the table whispered a quiet, "Impossible." Richard's smile disappeared. "What investment?" No one answered for several seconds. Then Michael spoke. "The $750 million commitment." Richard blinked. Once. Then again. The number seemed unable to find a place inside his mind. Linda opened the accompanying profile file. A photograph appeared on the screen. Every person in the room recognized the face instantly. Ava Brooks. Richard felt his stomach tighten. "No," he said quietly. Linda continued reading. "Managing partner. Impact Horizon Capital." Michael slowly lowered his head. Another board member covered his mouth with one hand. The room that had laughed only an hour earlier now sat in complete silence. Richard stared at the photograph. The woman they had dismissed. The woman they had interrupted. The woman he had personally asked to leave. She was not an observer. She was not an assistant. She was not a guest who had wandered into the wrong room. She was the person carrying the largest investment commitment in company history. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The city glowed beyond the windows. The boardroom remained motionless. Then Richard looked toward the closed conference room door and realized the meeting had never been under his control at all. Richard Coleman was already moving. Before anyone told him to. The moment the reality settled over the room, he grabbed his phone and headed for the conference room door. Behind him, the board remained frozen in stunned silence. Linda Foster called his name once, but he barely heard her. The hallway outside felt different now. Larger. Quieter. Every step echoed against the polished stone floor as he searched for the woman he had dismissed less than an hour earlier. Near the wall of glass overlooking the city, he finally saw her. Ava Brooks stood calmly beside the windows, her portfolio resting against her side. The skyline behind her glowed beneath the first lights of evening. She looked completely at peace. Richard slowed as he approached. For the first time all day, he was unsure what to say. Ava turned toward him before he spoke. She had already seen him coming through the reflection in the glass. Neither person spoke immediately. The silence stretched between them. Not hostile. Not comfortable. Just honest. Richard cleared his throat. "Miss Brooks." Ava waited. "I owe you an apology." The words sounded unfamiliar coming from him. Throughout his career, people apologized to him. Rarely the other way around. Ava listened quietly. Richard glanced down for a moment before continuing. "I made assumptions." His voice was lower now. "I judged you before I knew anything about you." The city lights reflected across the glass behind them. Ava's expression remained calm. "Yes," she said softly. Richard nodded. There was no argument available to him. No defense. No explanation that would make the truth less obvious. "I was wrong." Ava studied him carefully. Not with anger. Not with satisfaction. Simply with attention. The same attention she had given every number in his presentation. "Thank you for saying that," she replied. Richard seemed relieved for a moment. "Then perhaps we can start over." He extended his hand. The gesture hung between them. Ava looked down at it briefly. The same hand that had ignored hers earlier. The same hand that had signaled for the meeting to continue without acknowledging her presence. Richard noticed the hesitation. A faint shadow crossed his face. Then Ava smiled gently and accepted the handshake. Her grip was firm, professional, respectful. Richard exhaled slowly. The board would like the opportunity to continue discussions. Ava released his hand. "I am sure they would. The company values this partnership." Ava glanced toward the conference room. Through the glass walls, she could see figures moving inside. Executives speaking urgently. Directors reviewing documents. The atmosphere had transformed completely. Yet something important remained unchanged. "Do you know what concerned me most today?" she asked. Richard looked genuinely uncertain. Ava answered before he could respond. It was not the financial projections. Richard listened carefully. It was how quickly people decided who belonged in the room. The words landed harder than any accusation. Because they were true. Ava looked back toward the skyline. Capital can be replaced. Opportunities can be rebuilt. Her voice remained calm. Trust is different. Richard lowered his eyes. For the first time that day, he fully understood what had been lost. The investment was enormous. But the real cost was something far more difficult to recover. And deep down, he already knew what her next decision would be. For several seconds, neither person spoke. The city stretched beyond the glass in a sea of lights, thousands of windows glowing against the darkening sky. Ava Brooks looked out across Manhattan one final time before turning back toward Richard Coleman. There was no anger in her expression, no triumph, no desire to embarrass him the way she had been embarrassed. That was what unsettled him most. "I accept your apology," she said quietly. Richard nodded, grateful and disappointed at the same time. Grateful because she had shown him more grace than he deserved. Disappointed because he sensed what was coming next. Ava adjusted her portfolio beneath her arm. But accepting an apology and restoring a partnership are not the same thing. The words landed gently. Their impact was anything but gentle. Richard lowered his eyes. He understood. Behind the glass walls of the boardroom, directors and executives watched from a distance. Nobody interrupted. Nobody approached. They could all feel the weight of the moment. Ava continued. "This morning I arrived prepared to invest in a company with extraordinary potential." She glanced toward the conference room. "I still believe the company has potential." Richard looked up hopefully. Ava offered a small smile. "Potential is not the same as leadership." The hallway grew quiet again. Somewhere in the distance, an elevator bell sounded softly. Employees passed through the far end of the corridor, unaware that one conversation was changing the future of an entire corporation. Richard folded his hands together. "Is there anything I can do to change your mind?" Ava thought about the question. Then she shook her head. "Not today." The answer was honest. Not cruel. Simply honest. She reached into her portfolio and removed a single document. The withdrawal notice. Signed. Finalized. Professional. Months of negotiations had been reduced to a few pages of paper. Richard looked at the document, but made no effort to take it. He already knew what it said. Ava returned it to the folder. "My team will complete the formal process tomorrow morning." Richard slowly nodded. For the first time in years, he had nothing to negotiate, nothing to persuade, nothing to control. Ava extended her hand one last time. Richard accepted it immediately. There was no hesitation now, no assumptions, no audience to impress. Just two people standing in a quiet hallway. "I hope your company succeeds," Ava said. Richard looked surprised. She meant it. "And I hope this becomes a lesson that helps it succeed for the right reasons." The handshake ended. Ava turned and walked toward the elevators. Her footsteps echoed softly against the marble floor. Richard remained where he was. The elevator doors opened. Warm light spilled across the hallway. Ava stepped inside and pressed the lobby button. Just before the doors closed, she glanced back once. Richard still stood there, silent, thoughtful, changed. Then the doors slid shut. The elevator descended, floor by floor, 27 stories above the street. The boardroom remained unusually quiet. No one celebrated the presentation. No one discussed projections. No one laughed. Through the glass walls, the skyline shimmered beneath the night sky, while the lesson lingered in the silence. Respect given only after discovering someone's power was never respect at all. And somewhere below, Ava Brooks stepped into the city carrying nothing except her portfolio, her dignity, and the certainty that true worth had never depended on whether a room chose to recognize it.